over to you, Robert.
Thanks, Amber. Morning, everyone, and welcome. Very pleased to have you along this morning. So this morning we have 4 presentations, including one from me. We also have a short video that we'll show. So the brief synopsis is Jane Waterhouse, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, will be presenting a bit of an overview of the water quality and the reef issues. I'm then going to jump in to just talk about a very quick snapshot of how the Reef Trust Partnership is investing to try and respond to some of those issues. And then we have some more detailed presentations on some of the components of the Reef Trust Partnership. So Rob Hunt from NQ Tropics talking about one of our largest programs in the Lower Burdekin. Sam Marwood is talking about one of our innovation projects. And then we have a video from the Mary River. So with that, I'll pass over to Jane to provide her intro to the issues we're.
Thanks, Robert. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Waterhouse. I work with Coast Climate Ocean, so C2O Consulting, as well as Trop Water at James Cook University. I've been involved in water quality science and management for the Great Barrier Reef for about 23 years, and I'm currently providing one of the water quality advisor roles to the Great Barrier Reef Foundations and the Reef Trust Partnership. So I'm going to see if I can give you 5 minutes of water quality, and you'll probably have to hurry me along. So let's get started. Thanks, Amber. Okay, so we're all very familiar with the Great Barrier Reef. In a sense, it's big. It's highly valuable, both ecologically and economically, and it's also highly diverse. Really importantly for this story is it's connected to the catchment. So the catchment area that you see on the left of that map is as big as the reef itself. It's actually bigger, and it's all interconnected. So one of the main things is that catchment development has led to changes in the way that the catchment and the reef interact. There's runoff from the catchment that happens largely during rainfall events. It carries materials, including sediment, nutrients and pesticides to the reef, and that's increased as a result of that catchment development and changes in land use over time. Other aspects have changed the way that the systems interact, and so by clearing some of our coastal ecosystems or modifying them, the natural ability of those systems to treat some of those materials before they reach the reef has actually been degraded. Every region's different. You can see on the map that as you move from north to south, the reef is closer to the coast in the north and further offshore. We have a lot of seagrass areas in the inshore Great Barrier Reef, and just to mention about catchment development, it's largely occurred south of Cooktown, which influences what gets out to the reef in which areas. If we go to the next slide, unfortunately, the Great Barrier Reef isn't great at the moment. It's the last Outlook report reported it as being in very poor condition, and there's strong evidence of declining condition in many of the ecosystems, and that's well documented in the Outlook report. It's been through a lot in recent years. We've had back-to-back bleaching events, cyclones, crown of thorns starfish outbreaks, major floods and disease. Some of these things occur naturally, but they're typically enhanced by human development. Recovery time of species can be slow as well, so if we don't give the system a break, it just doesn't have the time to recover. The outcome of that is that managers have agreed that there's a sense of urgency to do stuff at local, regional and global scales, and I think that that's sort of where we are at the moment in the Great Barrier Reef scene, as we can't afford to wait to act. So next slide. The main factors that we look at managing are climate change and extreme weather, declining water quality and land-based runoff. So those two are probably the major ones, and they interact. And then the more direct uses are coastal development, and then other things like within the park, fishing, tourism and shipping, although they are quite strictly managed. So today we're focusing on water quality. So if we go to the next slide, it's many years now that the governments have acted together to try and address water quality issues on the Great Barrier Reef. In 2003, the first Reef Water Quality Protection Plan came out, and that was supported by an absolute immense amount of knowledge about water quality impacts on the Great Barrier Reef. Each period of update of that plan, which is approximately every 5 years, has had underpinning it a consensus of the scientific evidence at the time. So this slide really just shows the plans on the top and the evidence that supported it underneath. Each time there has been often a journal as well of peer-reviewed published articles that collect the evidence beforehand. Currently, there's a couple of those underway. One is the special issue for John Brodie in Marine Pollution Bulletin, and the other is the synthesis projects under the National Environmental Science Program. So they lead to, I guess, the evidence for update of the plan, which identifies the key actions that will be implemented in that 5-year period to address water quality issues on the Great Barrier Reef. Next slide. So the last consensus statement was in 2017, and we're currently in the process of preparing for the next one to come out next year. The conclusions were similar to the Outlook report, but basically that key Great Barrier Reef ecosystems continue to be in poor condition due to catchment development, extreme weather events and climate change impacts. That's not that different than previous conclusions, although the emphasis on the influence of extreme weather and climate has probably been enhanced. The second part, though, is something that was added in the last consensus statement, and it really recognises that what we're doing at the rate that we're doing is not going to meet the water quality target. So that's what we think we need to achieve to improve water quality on the reef. And to do that, a number of recommendations have been made about on-ground management, improvements to governance, program design, and delivery and evaluation systems, but also noted that that has to happen urgently. We don't have time to continue to just design and plan these things. We have to act in a very targeted way. So move to the next slide. So which are the aspects of water quality that we're targeting? So we've done a risk assessment of this, and it's updated periodically with the consensus statement. It's about nutrients, fine sediments and pesticides, and they're all a little bit different in where and how they act. So nutrients can be an additional stress factor, so it can make corals more susceptible to bleaching, for example. They promote and enhance the crown of thorns population outbreaks. That's largely in the mid-shelf and offshore reefs, and then largely in the inshore, but sometimes further offshore too, is the microalgal growth from enhanced nutrients. For fine sediments, it's about reducing light available for seagrass and corals, and that's typically in the inshore reefs. And for pesticides, their impact is largely closest to the system at which they're discharged. So that story is really about freshwater ecosystems, and then some inshore and coastal habitats. Combined with this is, as I said, the modification of coastal ecosystems and their reduced ability to assist in ameliorating those before they are delivered to the reef. So next slide, we have more knowledge now about then how do you target that? So if you know what the priority pollutants are, what do we know about where you should target their management? So in the last consensus statement, we defined priority areas. So there's a handful of basins that contribute to two or more of those pollutants. The highest priority basins for pollutant reduction for each of those materials, so for fine sediment and particulate nutrients, it's really the Burdekin, Herbert, Fitzroy and Mary basins, and that's largely around managing stream bank and gully grazing and gully erosion. For dissolved organic nitrogens, it's in the wet tropics catchments largely, but also the lower Burdekin. So of highest priority, the Herbert, Horton, Russell Mulgrave, Johnston Tully and the Plain Basin in Mackay-Whitsunday, and that's largely attributed to sugarcane, but obviously that changes in some areas and at a local scale. And then for pesticides, there's really only a few target basins there, and that's the Plain, Pioneer and Horton basins. So with that knowledge, we can then have a look and say, well, okay, where are we going to target that, and where is the most cost-effective places to make our investments? And that's what's been a driver for many investment programs, including the Reef Trust Partnership. So if we go to the next slide, that's really what I was aiming to cover today. Just a very high-level snapshot of where we're at with water quality and where we've got to in terms of the scale of knowledge that we have to inform management. So thank you.
Great, thanks Jane. If we jump on a couple of slides, please, Amber, onto the, and even onto the next one. So I manage the water quality team within the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, and under the Reef Trust Partnership, there's $201 million committed towards addressing those water quality issues that Jane has just touched on. So by way of a snapshot of how that's being invested, the majority of it is going into direct on-ground activities to try and improve management of the landscape and improve the health of the landscape to reduce what runs off and out into the reef. So there's $141 million allocated towards a series of 10 regional programs, and we'll touch on those more in just a moment. There's $20 million has already been invested into a series of 11 projects up and down the reef catchments. Most of those projects are finished or will wind up in the next few months. 10% of the investment, so $20 million, has been committed towards traditional owner-led water quality improvements. And the first tranche of water quality grants under that work stream will be announced in the coming days. There's about 18 projects going out to 22 traditional owner groups for work related to water quality improvement. We have a $10 million innovation and system change program, and the majority of those projects are up and underway. And there's a further $10 million that's been allocated for what we've called conservation and protection measures. And again, I'll touch on those more shortly. Next slide. So this is the $141 million. So this is the largest share of the investment. And as I mentioned, it's going out into 10 regionally focused programs. All of these regions are the high or very high priority areas that Jane noted under the water quality improvement plan and under the scientific consensus statement. There's 5 programs that are focused on dealing with nitrogen, and some of those also include pesticides, and then a further 5 that are focused on dealing with fine sediment. We'll hear in more detail on 2 of those today. So the Lower Burdekin program, you can see there, 20.4 million. Rob Hunt will talk about that shortly. And we have a video that we'll play later, which is around a restoration project that's been undertaken in the Mary River by Burnett Mary Regional Group, MRCCC and Alluvium, who are the consortium that are implementing that program. Next slide. So just for those of you who are unfamiliar with water quality programs in the reef, the majority of these projects, so that 141 million as well as the 20 million already invested, are going into projects, activities on the ground that are either about restoring the landscape, so addressing gullies where there's erosion happening, stream banks where there's erosion happening. So this can be through sort of major earthworks of the site we see here. Next slide. Working with landholders is a major focus. These are what we call practice change projects. So there's work particularly with the cane industry and with the grazing industry, as they're the major land users in the region, to try and work with farmers to identify better practices that achieve both good outcomes for them from a profitability and productivity perspective, but also good outcomes environmentally. And then last slide. And then there's also a smaller but important set of projects that are focused on what we'd call treatment systems. So they include things like constructed wetlands or landscape wetlands, which act as natural filters to remove pollutants as they head on their pathway down the catchment. So next slide. So where are we at the moment? So we're fast approaching the halfway point of the Reef Trust Partnership. The 10 regional programs that we touched on there, they're all up and underway. We have 38 projects ongoing on the ground, and that's about $103 million committed under those projects. So they'll all run up until June 2024. In addition, we've got 25 innovation projects. Details on those projects, as well as all those on-ground projects, are available on the GBRF website. I'd encourage you to look at them. Particularly encourage you to have a look at the innovation projects. It's a really interesting suite of projects there. We'll hear more from Sam in a moment about one of the projects that sits under innovative financing. There's also a suite of projects focused on technological transformation. So there's for example, a JCU project that's looking at robotic weed control using AI to identify weeds and to spot spray as a way of reducing pesticides. It's a Greening Australia project that's working with drones as a mechanism for seeding vegetation for wetland and riparian restoration. And there's a number of projects that are undertaking planning activities to try and support reef quality, water quality improvement. So, for example, a team at Griffith University's got a large data set from the power grid network and are analysing that. It's a LiDAR data set, I should say, from the power grid network, and they're analysing that to identify priority sites for investing in gully restoration and streambank restoration. Next slide. So what's different? As Jane said, there's a clear need to try and improve the way we go about addressing the challenges with water quality in the reef space. And so we've certainly tried to tackle some of those as part of the Reef Trust Partnership. So the key ones I'd emphasise firstly is taking a very strategic approach to our investment. Those 10 regional programs in particular, the decisions around where that funding would be invested was very much guided by a technical process, but also a value-based process that allowed us to have a whole of reef catchment view and to understand what we could achieve with the investment, and to make sure that we invested in the best places where we'd achieve the maximum outcome for the reef. We've also set clearly defined water quality improvement targets across the whole reef, but then and those spill down at the program level and at a project level. And so that's about having accountability really for what we're delivering, so that we'll be able to demonstrate how we've performed over the 6 years, but also to pass on that accountability to our program managers and to our individual projects to make sure it's clear what they are expected to achieve, not just in terms of inputs, but very much an outcomes focused approach towards targets. We've thought carefully about the type of governance arrangements and delivery approaches that will best support accountability as well, and about how we and have therefore structured those regional programs in a way that means that we can get the best out of all of the different partners that are involved. We've got, I think, over 200 partners involved in delivering the program. That's the number of organisations involved. So it's a huge effort to deliver this, and it's really critical that we've got arrangements in place that make sure that that everyone's working to their strengths and everyone's clear on what their job is. Fourthly, innovation has been very much embedded in the program. I mentioned the $10 million innovation program, but it's also interwoven throughout the entire program. We're really trying to drive innovation in the way all the projects are delivered, in the way we implement these sort of delivery mechanisms, all of these aspects. And finally, we're really looking to unlock the value of the data that's available. The information that we've got, both to drive change, to ensure investments made in the best possible way, but also to ensure accountability. And by data here, I mean data around what's being done, what the current condition of the landscape is, how landholders are operating, what inputs we're injecting to try and bring about change. And as part of that, we'll have live on the GBRF website quite shortly a series of dashboards, not just in water quality, but also across the other aspects of the portfolio, that'll highlight, in many cases, real-time data that flows in from all the reporting that comes from our projects, so that we, those projects, but everyone indeed, can see how we're tracking. Next slide. So there's the last slide. So what's next? So obviously there's an ongoing rollout of the projects. Most of the projects and programs are up and running, and the real focus in those is around integration. So trying to make sure that they're not just a suite of projects, but that they're that it's an integrated whole, and that we get any of the synergies that we can get out of them. Major focus on learning, trying to understand what's working and what's not, and on sharing that, on communicating between projects between programs across the whole portfolio, so that we really get the value, not just again from a suite of individual projects, but that we do have a tremendous opportunity here with such a large investment to try and bring together all that we're learning across all these projects and try and make the sum of the parts much more, or the whole much more than just the sum of the parts. There is a major funding release still to come in the Triple B catchments in the Burdekin. That'll come out in the coming weeks. And the last couple of programs that were up and underway are in the Tully Johnson and the Russell Mulgrave. We've just finalised shortlisting and we'll have projects underway there in the coming months. The last of the programs or the work streams to come is the conservation and protection work. That's a $10 million commitment to activities that are around preserving catchments rather than focusing on those where there's already been decline. And we're looking to kick off pilot projects up in the Eastern Cape later this year. Next slide. I think that's me done. So that's a very quick snapshot of the investment. I'll now pass over to Rob Hunt. So Rob's from NQ Dry Tropics, and NQ Dry Tropics are managing the Lower Burdekin water quality program that I introduced before. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Robert. Next slide. Thanks, Amber. So very quickly, rapid overview of the region, and I guess some of this background information really helps us to understand what's driving the water quality challenges in the Lower Burdekin, and also, I guess, contributes to the design and the suite of activities that are being proposed in the Lower Burdekin region. So we're talking about 100% irrigation within the region and about 80,000 hectares or so of cane. Locally, the area's divided into the older, I guess, more established delta areas and the more recent Briar area, which was developed around the installation of the Burdekin Falls Dam and the associated irrigation area. So that older area around the delta is predominantly smaller size farms, larger numbers of smaller size farms, predominantly lighter soils that are prone to deep drainage, as opposed to the Briar, which is heavier soils prone to more loss through runoff pathways. Thanks, Amber. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So whilst the pathways are different, the modelling suggests that the losses of DIN and pesticide are similar from both areas, just more so that how to address those is different, and I guess the level of confidence and understanding of those pathways varies as well. It makes spatial prioritisation a little bit more difficult, but ultimately that's unlikely to be a significant determining factor in designing a program. What's more important is that the program needs to be based around prioritised benchmark practices and focusing on the existing high risk practices, particularly those D-class practices, and moving them forward. What it also highlights is that no one solution is going to help us achieve the targeted water quality outcomes. There needs to be a balance between application rates of fertiliser and pesticide, but also irrigation practices need to be occurring on the same in the same spatial area to ensure that the water quality targets are actually going to be reached. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of priorities, as I said, fertiliser and pesticide application rates and the timing of those applications is clearly a driver of water quality, as is irrigation timing. Irrigation timing, or as we call it, scheduling, is really about preventing crop stress, whether it's too wet or too dry. So that ultimately increases nutrient use efficiency, and that's a key driver for maximising yield. So it's a pretty attractive option for growers to actually participate in. The other is improving irrigation application efficiency, which is more so about putting the right amount of water on. So again, minimising over application of water that would otherwise remove nutrients and pesticides from the cropping zone. It also has the added benefit of protecting downstream environments and reducing risk of rising groundwater, which is an emerging issue in the Lower Burdekin as well. So those three priorities are essentially driving the program design, with the addition of a consideration for wetland rehabilitation, So there's a lot of very high value wetlands within the Lower Burdekin. They're significantly impacted by agricultural development and by irrigation practices. And whilst they're possibly not the most cost-effective treatment process, there are considerable water quality and ecosystem service benefits, so they have been included in the suite. Next slide, please. So the program targets, as Robert pointed out, the investment value for the Lower Burdekin is $20.4 million. That's not going to solve all our problems, clearly. So we've had to, the alluvium report and other work previously done by people like Jane has really helped us to understand, well, what can we actually achieve with that amount of investment? And the targets were set 48 tonnes of DIN per year and 35 kilograms of pesticide per year, noting that their target load reductions at end of catchment and they're modelled. And the program timeframe obviously finishes June 2024. Next slide, please. So in the Lower Burdekin, there's a suite of projects that have progressed through to contracting. They're focusing on all of the major pathways with the ultimate, and all contributing to those DIN and pesticide targets. We have Precision Ag nutrient project through Pharmacist, Sugar Research Australia is leading a large consortium to deliver an irrigation project. Greening Australia is involved in some constructive wetland treatment program, and Green Collar is proposing some reef credit projects. And in the pesticide pollutant, Pharmacist has a continuation of Project Blue Water, which is specifically focusing on the pesticide reduction. Next slide, please. So I guess this slide's a little bit complex, but what it's basically showing is each of the projects and how they are delivering via different pathways and what their project targets are. So essentially, the design of the program, as it's funded at the moment, should exceed the program targets for the Lower Burdekin, and it's our role to obviously manage the coordination of those projects and ensure that they're being delivered collaboratively and remain on track to deliver those targeted or those contracted targets and the overall program targets. With a mention also that there's some external to the actual program, there's an innovations project that's also contributing and I guess value adding to the program as a whole. That project's being delivered through James Cook University. And I think the final slide, just to, I guess, identify that this program obviously can't happen in isolation. There's a lot of other investment in the space. It's quite a busy space. And so we recognise that, and we tried to map that out and actually demonstrate where each of the projects that have either recently occurred or are occurring now are contributing and which pathway they're contributing through. So you can see there you've got nutrient, soil management, irrigation and pesticide pathways, and the different projects are contributing through at least three of those programs, three of those pathways being irrigation, pesticide and nutrient management. So it's a complex space. We want to make sure that the program as a whole and the individual projects are not occurring in isolation and value adding to the existing investment that's in the region. And that's me.
Great, thanks Rob. So I'll just pass straight over to Sam, who's going to talk about one of our innovation projects.
Thank you, Robert. So my name is Sam Marwood. I'm co-founder and CEO of Cultivate Farms, and I'm very excited for this project we're rolling out now. And it's around farm ownership transition in the Herbert region, which you might be wondering what that could do with water quality. But our premise and our focus is around making farm ownership possible for the next generation. And we're tying in that concept, which is such a big driver for the next generation and for many farmers to own their land, tying that transition of ownership with improved water quality and improved farming practices. That's the cornerstone of this concept. How do we help next generation get onto farm ownership? And that's primarily going to be through transitioning ownership from retiring farmers to aspiring farmers. And during that transition, ensure that the water quality improvements are realised through appropriate farming practices. So we're partnered with Herbert Cane Productivity Services Limited team, and they're helping with those practical sides of things around the farming practices. And our job is around making these farm matches happen and building these relationships to get these ownership transitions happening. Thanks, Amber. So I'll give you a bit of an outline of who Cultivate Farms is and what we try and do, and then how this ties into this project. Thank you. So the core of this project is to establish 3 farm ownership transitions, which doesn't seem like a lot. There is a lot of work that goes into making people think about sharing ownership. The cornerstone for us, as I said, is around making ownership possible for the next generation, but farms are expensive. And unless you inherit a farm, most people don't think about owning their farm, and they go off and do something else. So we're providing a spark to say, no, you can own your farm if you partner with a retiring farmer or an investor. And we're encouraging people to do that. But that takes a lot of work to get aspiring farmers, so farmers out there working who want to take that step to own a farm, to encourage them to think like that and keep at it. It takes a lot of work to get retiring farmers to think about sharing ownership. It's a big decision. Farms are life, they're part of you. And to think about sharing is a big thing for many farmers, but there are many out there who don't have family to hand their farm onto, and love the idea of staying on their farm somehow, and sharing ownership is a key, could be a key outcome. Many just have not thought about it before. And that's our goal, is to have those relationships, get the attention, and then make these matches happen, and then ensure the water quality outcomes are realised as well. Thanks, Amber. So what we've heard and how we developed this project with the HCPSL is that we heard that retiring farmers are out there in the catchment, in the Ingham Township area, in the Herbert catchment. They're out there and they don't seem to have it. Many of them don't have that transition of ownership pathway mapped out, i.e. they don't have family to hand on to, or their family might not want it. And so they're probably stuck with the idea of, well, what do I do? I don't really want to sell. So we've seen that as an issue. It's an issue right across the Great Barrier Reef and right across Australia. The other issue is there's next-gen farmers who want to own farms. It is a massive driver, but they don't have the dollars needed in their back pocket to be able to get a loan to buy it. So how do we solve that problem for them? And the other issue we're dealing with is these ownership transitions. We know they happen. We're talking about vendor finance, and I'll go through a few examples. Vendor finance, lease to buy, equity arrangements, they do happen. It's just they're not promoted very much. And our job is to show that they are possible, they're normal, and encourage people to think about this idea of sharing ownership through normal transition arrangements. Thanks, Amber. So summarising all this, what we do is generate, I guess, a 3-sided marketplace. We're about inspiring next-gen farmers to keep at it. Just go back one, sorry, Amber. To keep at it and to follow their farm ownership dreams. We then uncover retiring farmers who want to share ownership, who can't hand their farm on to family, but don't want to leave and want to stay part of their farm. And the third is around investors, and this is getting very exciting, that we are uncovering investors out there who love the idea of investing in their local community or investing into farms which support water quality. And so we're trying to build this marketplace on all 3 of those, and then our job is to matchmake. I guess we did think about calling ourselves eFarmony, but it was too corny, so we stuck to Cultivate Farms. But it is about matching people and building relationships so that like-minded people can set up a business together and transition ownership of a farm. Next slide. As I said, there are many technical ways that these shared ownerships can happen with the retiring farmer and aspiring farmer, and with investors and aspiring farmers. And we don't get too hung up on those details. We know there are accountants and lawyers out there who can work through these arrangements. Our focus is building the relationship first, making sure a retiring farmer and aspiring farmer meet and they share the same values and have the same vision for a piece of land. We then make sure once they've got that match, they talk to their own advisors and lawyers around the technical arrangement. So a lot of the magic happens in getting the people together and making sure that they get along as the cornerstone. I've got some slides coming up now about some case studies. With the retiring farmers. If you go just to the next one, just to give you an example of how this can work. So this farm here is in central Victoria, and it was with Judy and Charlie Hocking. They've got kids, but the kids don't want the farm, and they said, they were very blunt about this. They said, we just want to die on our farm. We don't want to go anywhere, and we love the idea of sharing. And so we talked to them about what they wanted for their farm, their vision. We put a post up on Facebook. This is how easy it was for us on this one. And within a week, they had been connected with a farmer that they sort of knew. They knew that farmer. They knew enough about them. And our job was just to get the conversation going. And now there's an equity arrangement there where the young couple are now earning their way into owning quite a substantial investment and business. And the next one that I'll show you on this slide is more focused on investors. And so we have developed a pitching program, and there's another one happening on the 30th of March, which is next week. And we'll be running a new one as part of this program later this year, where we get farmers to develop an investment proposal and we put them in front of investors. And so we are excited by this ability to empower next-gen farmers. You know, they're out there trying to find retiring farmers, but we're saying also develop a plan and put it in front of people, and we'll get investors, and who knows who can be uncovered to back you onto the farm. And this is an example of Claire and Mark Coates. They went through this program and they were matched with an investor back in 2017. And we're up to our 4th program now of doing this and matching farmers. So a lot of this is empowering farmers to say you can own your farm, getting them to find retiring farmers or investors, and then on the way through, we are planning and working so that these farms have a water quality and, you know, a sustainability focus, which is, I guess, embedded in most of the farmers we're talking to in the next generation anyway. Next slide. So how the project unfolds is that we are doing a lot of convincing. We're out there. I'm heading to the Herbert catchment in a couple of weeks. We're out there talking to aspiring farmers, retiring farmers, and their advisors. And we've got a big pool of investors that is growing as well. And so our job at the moment is to inspire people to think about sharing ownership, which again is a big concept. And once we've inspired them, we'll start matchmaking. We're getting the aspiring farmers to develop investment proposals so they can show farmers why they're good enough and why someone would spend the time to get to know them. And at the same time, convincing and just encouraging these retiring farmers to think through all the options so that they're going with their eyes wide open about this idea of sharing. And we'll run a pitching event as well at mid-year in front of Australia for these farmers to see if they can uncover some investors to match them so that we ultimately can get those 3 matches, which is our core driver behind this whole project. So the ask for everyone watching is, please let me know if you know any aspiring farmers. We do focus across the whole Great Barrier Reef. We're just focusing a lot on the Ingham area. But if you know any aspiring farmers who would love to be able to own their farm, please connect them with us. Any retiring farmers who don't really want to leave and are looking for an option to be able to stay active on their farm, and especially local investors, people who want to be able to support their community, support water quality. We want to uncover those people and say, well, why don't you invest locally, back some great farms in your community? And that's it.
Terrific. Thanks, Sam. I must say it's one of my favourite projects of the very large suite of projects we've got running. I think there's just so much great about it. So look, for the final presentation, we now have a short video that Amber will bring up. So this is from our team at Burnett Mary Regional Group, the Mary River Catchment Coordinating Committee, and Alluvium, who are running the program in the Mary River, the regional program there, the $9.4 million.
This particular site, we'd watched that over the years where the bank was being eaten in. In every flood event there was a bit more soil going in. Then in 2010 and 2013 in particular, it was horrific. And there were trees this big that we had planted, that had grown there, that just went in. You hear this kaboom as big tons and tons of dirt hit the river.
The dairy operation started in '91 as a changeover from a beef herd. We planned the dairy and set it up to milk 200 cows, which means we have about 500 animals on the place. We know that in the 30 years since we've been here and revegetated the river, with a 5-metre buffer zone, it protected most of the riverbank from a 1 in 100 year event.
The Mary catchment is one of the 5 highest contributors of fine sediment of the 35 catchment that flow into the Great Barrier Reef. There's around about 70% of fine sediment generated from stream bank in the Mary catchment, And this is due to historical land clearing and extensive sand and gravel extraction throughout the river system, as well as clearing of riparian vegetation and grazing pressure.
Looking at how much of that sand is going out to the reef is a horrific thought. You know, we don't own that river, we don't own the reef, we're just custodians of this land.
The collaboration is really important because it brings together a breadth of knowledge and skills from the key players to be able to manage a very complex program of works. That's the Mary River Recovery Consortium. That includes Burnett Mary Regional Group, Mary River Catchment Coordinating Committee and Alluvium Consulting. So our role's really been to work closely with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. We provide oversight and governance to the project.
So we installed timber logs within the channel to provide habitat. Australian rivers used to have one of the highest loadings of large wood in the world, and that provided really important habitat for our native fish species. Obviously, as we've cleared riparian zones, that supply of large wood has been lost. So putting log structures back in the river is a really great outcome for our native fish species, including the Mary River cod. A few weeks before we were planning on implementing the project, we saw some scratchings on the bank that were potentially from a Mary River turtle. So we undertook some monitoring. We set up some fauna cameras just to make sure there were no turtles utilising the site for nesting. Fortunately, we didn't find any, so we were able to go ahead with the project.
Planting trees is the easy part of restoration. Maintaining them takes a long time. You need to be there whenever that tree needs you. So the restoration is the first step. The next part is maintaining those plants, making sure that the fences remain there.
So the environmental benefits are around improving the quality of water flowing into the Mary catchment, which flows into the Great Barrier Reef and helps to improve reef health and resilience. There are other benefits including climate and resilience, and also just really halting that bank retreat into valuable agricultural land.
I guess the dream would be to see as it was 200 years ago as a ribbon of standing vine scrub going down the valley. So we need to head in that direction.
No man is an island. You fit into a community, you have to do your bit. The feeling of having something like this done, firstly, it looks fantastic, but that feel good to know that we are doing something on our farm that benefits not just all the communities down the river, not just all those communities in the reef, but actually for the whole world. It's a real buzz.
So I think I'm going to hand back to Amber, who's now going to facilitate the questions.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to all of our panelists for those fantastic presentations. And we still have around 15-20 minutes to answer questions, which is fantastic. So while everybody is kind of absorbing what they've just heard, if you want to keep an eye on the Q&A chat box and add any questions that you might have as we answer these over the next 15 minutes or so. One of the top questions that we have is around uncontrolled land clearing, and will the Reef Trust Partnership work to reduce or eventually stop future land clearing?
Yes, so look, I'll answer that one. So as part of the Reef Trust Partnership, we're not working on lobbying on government policy, so we're not addressing that sort of issue. There's obviously work that's being done that does involve revegetation of works as a way to reduce sediment runoff that comes from particular priority areas. The conservation and protection stream of work, and I see that there are a few other questions that relate to it. And so I can answer that both here and also address some of those questions. It's coming from, I guess, the idea of recognising that there are areas that currently aren't high priorities, like the areas that Jane mentioned up on the Cape, north of Cooktown. Under the Water Quality Improvement Plan, they're not high priority areas because the water quality there is currently okay, but there is a risk from things like land clearing or other changes in land use practice. And so certainly that stream of work, we'll be looking at what options there are that we can, working with landholders in those regions, what can we do that reduces the potential for them to become a problem down the track. And so that could be investing in land use covenants to try and encourage people to protect the landscape. It could be, certainly we're looking to take a whole of sort of catchment approach, really integrated catchment management approach to some of those regions to try and better understand what's there, the wetlands, the upper catchment, all of these sort of areas, and think about what are the measures that we can put in place to improve the health of those catchments. And that includes addressing issues, again, which come to one of the other questions we've got around feral animals, feral animal control. So some of those projects are likely to, to be considered in the mix there.
So Robert, you're doing a fantastic job of moderating the questions. You don't even need me from here, I don't think, but I'll keep going through them, and we can collate them as we go. Was there any further detail you wanted to provide around or could provide at this stage around the conservation of work stream, the $10 million program there?
Sure. So there's the largest portion of that's going to go into one or a series of programs focused on-ground work looking at integrated catchment management with a focus up in the Cape. We're hoping to have a workshop up in Cooktown over the next sort of month or 6 weeks to try and come up and meet with as many of the stakeholders in that region as we can to talk about what the opportunities might be and to try and map out what sort of projects that we'd invest in. We're just in the process of finalising exactly what that looks like going forward. But ultimately, like as with all of the programs, there'll be open competitive calls looking for projects that contribute to those sort of broader objectives. So those objectives around improving the health of the catchment, protecting the catchment in an integrated way that's ultimately going to maintain or improve the water quality in those regions. And that, I think, that includes, issues like dealing with feral animals or feral weed or invasive weeds to the extent that they might be contributing to some of those problems.
So Robert, bumped up to the top of the list in the Q&A box is around considering business as usual, so to speak, of fertiliser, pesticide use, and instead developing what the question here says is truly sustainable practice such as improving soil health, integrated pest management, organic, biodynamic farming, crop rotation, etc. Your thoughts on that question, or to share with the panel?
Yep. So I can jump in first at least. So there's certainly a couple of projects under the innovation stream that we're funding that are looking at these sorts of issues. So one of them's a CSIRO-led project that's looking at regenerative grazing. So it's investigating how those sort of practices are currently being rolled out and looking at how effective they are in genuinely improving water quality. Similarly, there's a project that's being rolled out in the Mackay region that's, I guess, touches on these issues, which is looking at innovation in cane farming, and it's around new technologies for promoting multi-species fallow cropping. So how you plant a whole lot of different species during your fallow as a way of improving the soil health and also reducing the amount of runoff coming off the paddock.
Fantastic.
Whether Rob or anyone else wanted to say anything about those sorts of...
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I agree, and I guess to add to that, certainly the projects that are progressing in the lower Burdekin, they offer services to growers generally. So the overall objective obviously is to reduce or to better match application rates to crop requirements, but there is also an emerging interest in soil health, as there is in other GBR regions, and the service providers who've been contracted to deliver these projects are actively involved in those types of initiatives as well. So it's very much a grower-focused delivery approach. So there is an emerging interest in those forms of technology, and so I'm certain that the projects are going to add value and continue to respond to that demand from growers. and also to promote practices as they are proven and help trial new ideas. So there's a suite of projects out there that are delivering a whole range of different services.
Rob, this potentially is a question for yourself, but I'll open to the panelists. We have an attendee from New Caledonia who's listening in on how the Reef Trust Partnership is contributing to supporting the Great Barrier Reef through water quality improvement. So I guess the question is around stakeholder engagement and grower and farmer engagement. So I guess how do you embed that into your program, or how do you think that is progressing in the regional program that NQ Dry Tropics is managing?
Okay, so the program, there's two key drivers to the program design. One is obviously the targets and the science behind what we believe are the best mechanisms or the best levers to pull to deliver those water quality outcomes. But the delivery providers themselves, through the original EOI and or expression of interest process, they've been able to bring their ideas to the table, and those organisations are very closely aligned and linked to the grower networks. So they're essentially bringing those innovations and those ideas and those understandings about what growers are actually seeking and what they need and what their limitations are, and what the realities are on the ground, and we're matching those with the science and the targets, and we're trying to find that pathway forward. So the program really essentially is just a marrying of those two realities, if you like, and trying to find, I guess, that best balance. And as I said in my presentation, that based on the contracted arrangements moving forward, there's an expectation that we should exceed those targets in the lower vertical.
So next up, we have a question for Sam around how is water quality improved in the farm ownership transition project? So is there a requirement, for example, to get accredited under industry best management practice programs, for example?
Yeah, I think the core is just around adopting best management practices. My understanding is that some of the older generation probably aren't as on top of those methods as the next generation might be. That's the theory, which is not always the case. So we'll be working with the Herbert Kane Productivity Services Limited team who understand all those details inside and out, and work with the farmers every day on that. So it'll just be getting them to work alongside around the water quality methods for their specific farm on that case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Sam. Next, I've got a question for Jane, which will then, I think, lead into a more targeted question on this for Rob. Jane, a question here around, the Reef Trust Partnership is not the first investment in improving water quality on the Great Barrier Reef. As you mentioned, governments have been investing in this for decades and working together on improving the water quality entering the reef. How would you summarise the real improvements that we've seen in that time?
Something I thought of after I gave my talk, I didn't talk about the social side and the engagement aspects of the science, and that's been a really significant change, I think, in the way that Great Barrier Reef water quality is being managed and recognised as an important area for management in the Great Barrier Reef, particularly over the last 5 years. So there's a recognition that engagement is really important. We need to focus on also, the social and community aspects of the work, and Sam's project is a perfect example of that. Rob's project's working closely with landholders and just recognising what it is that will help people, what do they get out of making a change, and the benefits of water quality improvement as well, and working one-on-one. So I think one of the main things is we've switched from using, we use a mix of tools. So there's extension, there's incentives, there's also regulation in the mix. But having that combination of things together, including restoration, I think is a massive step forward for making those improvements in recent years.
Thank you, Jane. And then Rob, this is a question around achieving those improvements specifically for the Lower Burdekin program. Just a clarification around, is the work that the program or the targets that the program has, is that looking to transition to improving the water quality entering the reef, or stopping the ongoing decline? So we'll be, that we won't see an improvement, but we'll see the decline in water quality stop.
Well, the two are intrinsically linked, but I guess we've got to be clear that the Reef 2050 targets are far larger than what this individual program is going to deliver. But clearly this program is going to be very, very important in making a significant contribution to that overall reef water quality target. So, I mean, I think in the Lower Burdekin, the required modelled DIN reduction is somewhere in the realms of 700 tonnes of DIN, and this program's anticipated, or the target is to deliver 48. We're hoping to get a little bit more out of it, so it's a significant contribution towards it. But we've got to understand that it is only one program in a whole range of investment portfolio that are all working collectively towards making delivering the overall water quality target requirements.
Thanks, Rob. Jane, this is more of a general question. I'd perhaps suggest is one for you, but happy to share more broadly to the panelists as well. What does the science or consensus sort of point to on riparian restoration? Should this is looking to future funding. So, this webinar is obviously focused on the Reef Trust Partnership investment and the work under this body of investment. But the riparian restoration is something for future priorities as a consideration?
Yeah, I'd say it's in the mix. It's certainly in the mix of the current program, and as we saw in the Mary, it's one of the actions. So stream bank remediation, when you've got large contributions of stream bank erosion, becomes really important, and obviously riparian restoration is an important part of that. Our challenge is that the science is still catching up a little bit there. It's so variable, it's very science specific. We have actually identified it as a priority in the Reef Trust Partnership as something that we'd like to capture more information on in terms of evaluation. So what works in what situations, so that we can start to provide more guidance about that. Does that answer that question?
I believe it does. I'll keep an eye on the chat box if there's any further clarification needed, of course.
Yeah.
And I think, given we're right on top of the hour, I think we've managed to address most of the key questions that were raised in the Q&A. But of course, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to any of our panelists. Very happy to keep the conversation going.